Good evening. I'm Scott Poole, Dean of the University of Tennessee College of Architecture and Design, and I welcome you to our lecture tonight. We're very pleased to have Kengo Kuma and Balazs Bognar with us tonight to discuss their impressive work. Tonight's lecture is supported by General Shale, a longtime supporter of our college. It demonstrates the power of partnerships and what can happen when academia, industry, and the design professions come together. The future of design education, especially in land-grant universities like ours, hinges on our ability to intertwine our internal creative culture with a durable portfolio of non-academic partners. To evolve, grow, and choose to do what no one else can do, we will need substantial support from a broad spectrum of non-academic partners and a willingness to invent, adapt, and change at the pace of innovators in the profession. Tonight's lecture represents just that, adapting and collaborating with partners for the good of education and the design professions. Before we introduce our lecturers, I'd like to take a moment to recognize special guests from General Shale. Joining us tonight are Steve Samsel and Josh Brock. Steve and Josh, the college and I, personally, thank you for General Shale's consistent and remarkable support of our college and our students for more than 25 years. We're honored to call General Shale our partner. Founded in 1928, General Shale is headquartered right here in Tennessee with 14 locations across the country, employing almost 2,000 people. It is one of North America's largest brick, stone, and concrete block manufacturers. Not only does General Shale support this lecture each year, but the company also generously provides numerous scholarships for students and provides workshops to help the craft of brick masonry continue into the next generation. We look forward to many more years of this collaborative partnership. Now let's get started with tonight's lecture with Assistant Professor Meged Girgis, who will introduce Kengo Kuma and Balazs Bognar.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening. I'm Meged Girgis. I'm an assistant professor of design and structural technology at the McCarthy Endowed Professor, and also I'm the chair of the lecture and exhibition committee. Thank you for joining us tonight, and welcome to the University of Tennessee College of Architecture and Design General Shale sponsored lecture. I am very excited to present tonight's guest speaker, Kengo Kuma and Balazs Bognar. Kuma-san was born in 1954 in Yokohama, Japan. He completed his master's degree in architecture at the University of Tokyo in 1979. He studied Columbia University as a visiting scholar from 1985 to 1986. He established Kengo Kuma and Associates in 1990. He taught at the Keio University from 2001 to 2008 as a professor, and in 2009 as an appointed professor at the Graduate School of Architecture in University of Tokyo. Among Kuma-san's major early works are Keiro-san Observatory in 1994, the Guest House Water Glass in 1995, which received the Benedict AIA Award, and the Noah Stage in the Forest at Toyama Center for the Performance Arts, which received in 1997 the Architecture Institute of Japan Annual Award. The Nakagawa Machi Batu Hiroshogi Museum of Art we received in 2000 the Murano Prize, the Great Bamboo Wall in China in 2002. Recent works of Kuna-san include the Santuri Museum in 2007, Nizo Museum Information Center in 2002 from Tokyo, the Nakuga City Hall in 2012, Nakuga, the fifth Kapuzika in 2013, also in Tokyo, the Kyushu Gibbon-kan in 2013, and Tokyo Central Post. The Office Kite in 2013, Tomashima City Hall in Tokyo in 2015, Toyama Keiari Toyama Glass Art Museum at the City Library, and Kumasoda City Fabo in 2015. The completed projects outside of Japan include the Piscon Art Center and Site de la Musique in 2012, the Fonds Régional d'Art Contemporaire in Marseille, the Darius Milhaud Conservatory Music in 2013, the Interpot McDonald Education and Sport Complex in 2014, and the Lyon Confluence Hikari in 2015, and the China Academy Arts Folk Art Museum. A number of large projects has been completed in recent years, such as the Victoria Albert Museum building in Dundee, in Scotland, University Multifunction Center at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland in 2016, and many other more. Kengo Kuma and Associates also completed the new national stadium in Japan in 2020, along with Taisi Corporation and Azusa Siki. Kuma-san was awarded with the International Spirit Nature Wood Architecture Award in Finland in 2002, the International Architecture Awards, the Best New Global Design for Shakura Plaza and Shelter in 2007, and the Energy Performance and Architecture Award in 2008 in France. He's an International Fellow of RIBA in UK and also the Honorary Fellow of AIA of the US. He also written numerous books, and most of the titles had been translated into Chinese and Korean. His major writing, Anti-Object, Natural Architecture, Small Architecture, have been published in English from the AA Publications, the Book Department of AA School, and also UK prestigious architecture institutions. Allow me also to introduce our second speaker tonight, Balazs Bognar. Balazs Bognar is an American architect and partner at Kengo Kuma and Associates in Tokyo, with license in United States and NCARB certification. He has been working directly with Kengo Kuma to oversee the office in North American projects since 2007. He received his Master of Architecture degree in 2003 from Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and his Bachelor of Arts Architecture in 2000 from Washington University in St. Louis. His completed work includes Alibaba's Toyota City campus in Hangzhou, China, the Red Bull Music Academy in Tokyo, Japan, and Portland Japanese Garden Culture Village in Oregon, the Rolex Tower, Dallas, in Texas, 2018, and the Anpuri Retail Pavilion in Phuket, Thailand. He's currently leading the teams for new projects in Sydney, Tokyo, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Jose, Los Angeles, and Detroit, and is working his second book with Professor Untitled Bognar in University of Illinois. For attendees, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A feature, and we'll address them after the lecture. Without further ado, allow me to welcome Kuma-san, Kengo Kuma, and Balazs Bognar. It's great to have you both, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah, good morning. And now as the total time is 7:40 in the morning. I want to do a short comment about recent project and our philosophy, and then after I want to pass to Balazs Bognar. So we are working together for a long time. I want to share the screen. Yeah, first I want to show our national stadium project we designed the stadium for Tokyo Olympic 2020, but unfortunately because of COVID is postponed, and it will come finally July this year. And I want to explain what we were thinking for the stadium. And actually before COVID, everybody began to think the city is too big, and the tower is too tall, and we are too far from nature. And as a basic idea for the stadium is how to going back to nature, how to going back to natural material, and how to open the building to environment. And then our solution is to use the wood, especially the local wood is important. Japan is a country of forests, and actually still now 7% of our land is forest. And as I want to show that this kind of the unique as a environment of Japan. And as we used as a wood from 47 prefectures of Japan, and actually this is cedar. That is, each cedars from 47 prefectures has different color, different textures, and different grains. I want to show that kind of diversity. Even in the small countries, we have such diversity. And I think this diversity and this richness of natures is coming from as our attitude to land, our attitude to environment. And this is a holy temple. This pagoda is considered as oldest wooden building in the world. It was built 7th century. So already 1,400 years passed after the completion of the building, but still surviving. The secret is a unique section of the building. The wood is protected by this unique section, and also people can enjoy the beauty of wood and beauty of detail of wood, the beauty of texture of wood. So I want to do the same magic for our building. And also we try to integrate with the vegetation and the material, vegetation and the big building. And even for this big building, so we believe we can be integrated with the environment and nature. And also we try to create the public space in the stadium. Most of the sports building is enclosed building, when people are not doing sports event, but this stadium is open to public the 365 days a year, and as the openness and the publicness is the theme of this building. And even as a nighttime, it's just open to public. And then we tried many new material for the building. The roof is supported by composite structure of wood and steel, and so we can achieve lightness by this kind of composite structure system. And as the edge of the roof, so we have the photovoltaic panel is a new transparent type of photovoltaic panel. It looks like normal glass, but as it has same the efficiency as normal as a photovoltaic panel. And our idea is by using new design, by using new technology and going back to nature again. And before as a COVID, so we began to think like this, but COVID pushed us to this direction further. The COVID is a big turning point of the history, I think. Generally, as the history of Homo sapiens is from centralization to the city. And so we started from hunters and gatherer, and after the agriculture started, and after industrialization started, and the big city started, and taller. But finally, this kind of centralization bring us to the big crisis. The theme after COVID is how to going back to nature and how to going back to fullest. And as a this stadium can be as a one example of that kind of a new direction. And besides that, as a stadium, so we are trying to find another solution, how to go back to nature again. This is a very new project we did for the Tokyo Tech. The Tokyo Tech is a big university in the center of Tokyo. So, but we designed this hill-like building, and as a building is margin to the surface of the ground, and it's not outstanding at all. This is the detail of the building. The topography is the theme of our architecture design. And also at the same time, so we are very much interested in detail of ground surface. And today, I want to pass this theme to Balazs Bognar. So we are working together for a long time. And he sometimes brings this idea to a different context. I think this is as a cultural exchange is very interesting for us. As I want to talk about one example of this cultural exchange. The Frank Lloyd Wright, maybe you know that great architect. He came to Japan many times, and he learned the Japanese traditional architecture, and he tried to apply those Japanese ideas to American context. Also try to do the same exchange in different period. And Balazs working for that kind of a trial maybe he will explain about the process of that kind of exchange and process of that kind of translation. And as after COVID, that kind of exchange will be more important than before. And today, he can talk about what we can do after COVID. I want to pass to Balazs. So Balazs, are we ready?
Yes, one moment. Thank you very much, Kuma-san. I really appreciate this excellent overview. Give me just one moment. Okay. Thank you, Kuma-san. That's excellent. And if you'd be so kind then as to turn off the audio and video. Hello, everybody. I greatly appreciate being here. And thank you, of course, to University of Tennessee School of Architecture and Design, General Shale for making this possible, Maged Gergis, Dean Poole, and the entire team for the organization. I would like to tip my hat also to Mark Takei, who was a former professor of mine during my WashU years. And again, thank you, Kuma-san, for entrusting me with the commentary for the following period of time. I want to be respectful of your evening. I've got a lot of things to share with you, and maybe just by way of brief introduction, since Maged was so kind as to give a little bit of background, allow me to say just a few things about myself. I'm a partner at Kengo Kuma Associates. I was originally one of 8 and now one of 20. And that is to say, I'm one of many, and I'm part of a next wave of representatives for the work of Kengo Kuma and Kengo Kuma Associates. I've been working with Kuma-san since about 2007, which is creeping up on about a decade and a half. So one might imagine that gives me maybe a little bit of an insider perspective on things. However, I am an American, a mixed background American, and I'm the only American partner in the office. I'm one of a handful of non-Japanese partners in the office as well. I'm from Urbana, Illinois, which means that I'm a small town Midwest university guy in a very, very large city. My understanding of nature is very, very different. So my outside perspective, and I guess I see myself a little bit on the border of both being part of the team and seeing things from an outside, it allows me to understand our work from a critical view, to understand our practice, that is, what is we do, to find overlaps between cultures, as Kuma-san had mentioned, to think deeply about what lessons we can apply in the future. So think about my role a little bit, not only as a designer in the office, but also an editor, a mentor, a student of our work, a critic, an interpreter, and for the next short bit of time, your tour guide across geography and across the ideas of our work. Our methods, and it's important to remember, these are kind of key points, but it's important to remember above all that ours is a method of testing, of a way of trying things to understand the environment, to understand what it is that we do in the larger world. We try to ask ourselves big questions and then answer by way of design. We experiment, so it's not always going to be the right answer from the start. Ours is a work of evolution, so we make incremental changes, testing parameters, and ours is an approach of continuity with the site and across ideas. I've got a great tour for you prepared this evening, and forgive me my exuberance as I've got many, many projects, some of which you will not have seen, and they will all be linked in a way that has not really been seen before. The categories that you see up on screen, if I go point by point, the first one is with nature and tradition. That is to say, I'll look a little bit more at a traditional understanding of relationship to the site, to nature. The second category will look at the evolution of a detail across a series of projects. And the third is to look at the way in which some natural kind of fundamental elements are essential materials in the way that we do work. It's a dense show, and I'm going to be, again, linking them in ways that hopefully will be elucidating. So hang on to your seats and let's get started. Let's start a little bit with more traditional grounding in the way that we understand space. And I'm intentionally showing you a pathway here in a Japanese garden. This is in Koto-in in Kyoto. The reason why that this is important is that it's not really first about architecture. It's about the site, it's about approach, it's about the delay of time in visiting a tea house, for example. Oftentimes, the traditional Japanese garden would be of diminutive stature, so the host would delay the guest's arrival by inviting one to sit and see, to spend time within the garden before arrival. There's a sense of slowing of time, an expansion of space, and a real moment of pause to understand one's position within the cosmos. This is a photograph of Portland Japanese Garden's own tea house, the former one that was brought over by Sony Corporation and the original one from the 1960s. In our work, you can see again this notion that while you can see your destination, the approach is never direct. Please note the zigzagging path that enters to the guest pavilion of our Water Cherry private residence. Here is the approach at Nezu Museum from 2009 in the heart of Tokyo. You can see here that before entering into the museum, the pathway is the device that always links the visitor across space. There's a sense of layering, there's a sense of slowing down, and a kind of sequence of space before one enters into the museum proper. I'm going to bring you now to Portland very briefly, where if we were to summarize the project in one phrase, it's that we simply reconnected a pathway. We connected the dots. Let's spend a brief moment here. North is to your right, and the city of Portland is to the south there. Previously, one would enter through a driveway, which you can see starting from the bottom of your slide with a dashed line before, and this is a bus, kind of tour bus driveway, before one would get to the gate, traverse and ascend a hill, only to be deposited at the top there in a dashed circle, the kind of service yard of the garden, before then being deposited at the main gate. So it was a bit of a stutter, stop, start, and a bit of a confusion in the orientation. What we simply did was to connect all of those dots so that the formal entry, the ticketing, was brought all the way down to the road, unlike before. The preamble to the antique gate was set up in a more kind of honorific way. And then before one enters to the main gate, the upper main gate, we provided a village, a series of buildings that framed a space and framed the existing gardens beyond. Let's take a really, really brief walk up that hill. And again, we can return to this later, but I'd like to give you a sense that it's about the space, it's the continuity, it's about an approach and a sequence more than the individual buildings themselves. This is the ticketing pavilion down below. It gives the presence of the garden at the street level, but what you'll immediately notice below is a series of stepped ponds, bamboo, and extended garden and vegetation all the way down to the road. It bears noting that that is basically a fancy way of disguising the storm runoff system. So all of that is treated underground and the visible components of it remain above ground. If we were then to go and purchase our tickets and enter into the slot of light there that you can see as there's a red person in a red jacket, you can also, if you train your eye slightly up the hill to the right, you can see the village peeking out through the trees. Here is that main gate. So now instead of walking up a driveway, we are approaching a gate that is then beheld in a particular way that positions it correctly in this sequence. And again, you can see the village up above. This is one of my favorite photographs of the project because it's almost entirely about the forest that it surrounds. The village there peaks in the background, and you can see almost as though we were to be approaching what in Japanese culture is termed monzen machi. It's basically the village at the gates, typically of a shrine. It's the site of a pilgrimage, and it's the town that grows up around the temple or the shrine for the visitors who come to visit it. This is the case here for Portland Japanese Garden as well. The ascent leads us to the tea house over there on the left, again, peeking out behind the tree, reminiscent of Kyoto's Kiyomizu-dera, peeking out over the ravine. The entry there is then flanked by the two buildings, the third one there in the beyond. And again, it's really important here. It's not about a monolithic architecture. It's about the space that it defines. We are now passing the courtyard and we're looking back from the main gate to the primary space. You can see the two main buildings flanking the courtyard. There's the second main entry beyond with the castle wall. It's the first of its kind in centuries. And let's take a look at that in plan. And I've artificially highlighted the zigzagging so you can see that the roof line, the way that it's modulated, it basically disappears back into the landscape. It defines two key spaces, that kind of driveway drop-off courtyard, what we call the second main entry over there to the left, upper left, and the courtyard over there on the lower right. And the arrow that's pointing out there was the view from the previous slide here. And that's the position of the main gate. This is also echoing Kyoto's Katsura Villa. And of course, from many, many centuries before. This is precisely the same scale as the previous slide. The north arrow orientation is roughly the same as well. So you can see that there are kind of reverberations across time. This kind of technique is really important in being able to hold space. The zigzagging line in Japanese is called ganko yane. It's the formation of the flying geese. That magenta arrow will then give us the view on the next page here. And you can see that a larger volume is broken down into smaller masses by way of the roof line. It also starts to define the space, kind of what I like to call the inside crook of the elbow, and creating a whole series of outside corners as well. It gives a sense of depth, it gives a sense of intimacy and human scale. The big difference, of course, is that Katsura Villa was elevated on a level much like a piano nobile, whereas a similar sort of view in Portland Japanese Garden is contiguous with the ground. So there's a free flow of people and activities across the corners and across the boundaries. This is just an example. This is another project of ours, a similar sort of motif and method. You can see the open corners there. This is a private residence in Eastern Japan. I would like to point out to you the device of the roof zigzagging as you'd seen in the previous slides, as well as the arrow highlighting the deck or the veranda below. That is called engawa in Japanese, and it's a really, really important spatial framing device. Again here, Katsura Imperial Villa. This is one of our key hints at what architecture is as it's related to nature. The reason why this is so important to us is that it's not a photograph of architecture. It's a photograph of the way that architecture relates to nature. So all you see at the top of the frame or don't see is the roof line, as well as the floor below with that similar deck. This is the moon viewing pavilion with Katsura Villa. But you can see this typology echoing throughout time. This is Shisendo, also in Kyoto. Here again, I'd like to note the proportions just slightly changing. Always a means of grabbing the view beyond, which in the case of Japanese spatial device is called shakke. You can see again the tatami and the wood on the floor, as well as the roof above. In our work, Nezu Museum 2009, the proportions again shift. The roof becomes a much more primary device, and the landscape beyond becomes a low horizontal slot. This is our project again in Eastern Japan. You can see here, again, the proportions have changed, but the typology and the devices are the same. At Portland Japanese Garden, once again, the veranda almost merges in an invisible manner. We have a floating tatami platform at the corner for tea performances, and again with the roof framing the existing garden beyond. So imagine this courtyard, this kind of invisible protagonist whose fourth side is the garden beyond, and our architecture, our buildings simply are aiming to frame all of that. So I'm going at breakneck speed here, but what I'd like for you to note is that the site always comes first. Architecture is a supporting character. We are always interested in strong and direct connections to nature. We are interested in achieving that by permeable or flexible boundaries, and always with an eye on human scale. So if the first category was a little bit about some traditional grounding in the way that we honor nature and the environment around us, the second one will be looking at some of the techniques, particularly with a detail of wood. As you might very well know, a lot of our projects are very strongly passionate about wood as a material for a number of reasons. But I'd like to take a specific look at a traditional toy that was originating in Hida Takayama, which is in Gifu Prefecture. And the reason why this is important is that it's a friction fit joint, it's triaxial, and there's a special notch in each one of those axes that slotted together and rotated creates a snug fit that can easily be assembled and disassembled. So you can see that sequence on the left there showing the progress of those pieces coming together, an example of the toy there on the right. We asked ourselves, what happens if you take that same joint and you make a modular furniture set from it? So this is sort of an experiment. For those of you following along with the dates, please note that this is not intentionally chronological because the ideas come about and develop at different stages. What I'm really interested in showing you is a kind of evolution, work that is not so much about an individual design, but the way in which it grows and tunes itself over the course of several projects. So there's a photograph of the single piece and against a kind of palette, as it were, of several of these pieces with the notches as shown in the background there. We asked ourselves, what happens if you take that same modular furniture system and it becomes a pavilion? I should probably point out that in the furniture set, we had walnut that was basically about 1 inch by 1 inch. Whereas here in this pavilion, we are now talking about treated cypress. It's about 2 inches by, a little over 2 inches by 2 inches in profile. And this is for Salone in Milano in 2007. You can see here the system of putting it together requires no mechanical fastenings or adhesives. You just lay out the pieces, slot and rotate them together, and you can see that the layers of the pavilion are put together by just a few people. There is the pavilion in its final form. If you were then to increase the scale and you go from pavilion, and again, an experiment at a smaller scale, growing to a larger scale here with architecture, this is GC Prosto. That same dimension is carried through to this building now with the 2 inch by 2 inch components carried over at 0.5 meter spacing, which is just a little bit over a little under 2 feet, sorry. And this building is entirely defined by this lattice. It's a structural grid, and it's treated, so it's fireproof. And for those of you interested, the actual physical boundary of glass is slotted between and interspersed so that you would never really detect that just visually. This is a look up into the space. You can see that it's almost kind of a magical view that we're really talking about infinity. And it's purely about that joint being repeated. Let's switch to Shikoku, where we are now in Yusuhara, which is the city of Yusuhara has been a kind of kind sponsor of a lot of our work. The dimension of the pieces have increased now to just over 6 inches by 1 foot. It's a sizable amount. The wood is now glue laminated cedar, and they're all cantilevered in such a way, they're kind of telescoping outward. We'll take a look in the method of Tokyo, and not the city Tokyo, but it's like a traditional Japanese technique, oftentimes seen in the temples. You can see here the context in which it sits. The region after World War II saw a resurgence of the cedar trees. And the reason why this is important is that there was a surplus, right? There was kind of deforestation, and then the trees were replanted. They're fast growing. And the surplus compelled the city to ask offices such as ours to ask how is it that we can display some of these? How can we show our technique? You can see here that what we're doing is we're basically flexing all of that natural material into a kind of a gallery bridge museum. This is the section on the left, and the kind of visceral view underneath. You can see the way in which the bridge steps outwards. The stacking occurs in kind of layers, and they step outwards in this cantilever. It's almost like wooden masonry, in the words of Kumasa. There's that view in the evening time. It takes on a kind of ethereal presence, and in a way, while each of those pieces, the glulam describes sort of a heavier dimension timber, as we saw before, it still talks to a particular lightness and maybe even an efficiency of the material. Let's step down in scale. Now we're going to a cafe on the shoreline of Ito. This is again in Shizuoka Prefecture. The dimensions have now reduced again to a little over 2 inches by 2 inches. And I'd like to point out to you, if you squint your eyes toward the center of the screen, you'll see thin white filaments peeking in the background of this cloud-like wooden structure. And I'll get to that in a minute. This section here shows the way in which that wood is stacked together. It's a very light structure that happens to sit kind of with a kind of a floating presence on the land. You can see in the upper right-hand corner. The wood there does the primary work, both with regard to compression and seismic performance. But if you look at that magenta curvature that comes through, that's a 9mm carbon fiber rod that basically ensures that the structure maintains its stability as a kind of redundant system. If you look closely at the section, there are two vertical lines there within the body of that assembly, and those are the kind of few mechanical fastenings of the central kind of pylon, as it were, in the middle. At night, all of this disappears, so that really we're talking about an assembly, a kind of light piling of wood, and the only metal columns that appear to be mullions occur at the 4 corners. And again, those dimensions have been minimized to a nearly impossible 3 inches by 3 inches. And again, just to show off the capability of the material. So again, I want to remind everybody that we've gone from a toy to an assembly that really looks like a cafe, to a bridge to a cafe. I'm going to take you very briefly to Germany. This is a yoga pavilion in the midst of the forest there, not far from Munich, near the Neuschwanstein Castle. And you can see that similar scale of the cafe now is immersed in the green. You can see here that the wooden elements have pulled apart a bit. They've flattened. The thin dimension now is a little bit over 1 inch, and I believe that the vertical dimension is about 1 foot. And you can see here that the cloud-like structure has kind of pulled away to allow for this panorama, almost 270 degrees of forest view. The wood here is fir, and you can see that the way that the lights have been placed in the ceiling and the way that the view comes in, it's really an effect of dappled light coming through the forest canopy, a term that the Japanese call komorebi. Let's take that same detail to a restaurant in Shizuoka Prefecture. And for those of you who, after the borders open back up after the pandemic, this is really close to Koeda Cafe, so it's a really nice back-to-back of lunch and tea. But you can see here the canopy emerging out from the terrain. The canopy there looks a little bit more organized as compared to what we'd seen before. You can see in the daytime there, it's almost as though the roof has simply floated out from the vegetation, and you can see also the thinner, lighter deck of the dining area below. That detail is made possible here. If we zoom in on the entry area, we can see that these larger, thinner, and flatter boards have slotted together up at the top, creating effectively two structural layers that continue all the way through. They span up to about 11.5 meters at their longest point. Be that as it may, all of these force lines and all the way in which these two layers cover the space draw the eye outward towards the panorama beyond. There is that view again, and you can see there's a hybrid steel and wooden frame assembly there, and it's primarily taken care of by the wood, but we've also provided kind of this hybrid combination structure. I'm going to take that same detail now, and our question is, what happens if we simply flex all of those lines into three directions? This is Sunny Hills, which is a pineapple cafe, a tea cafe in the back streets of Aoyama, central Tokyo. Very, very popular, but basically for those in the know. There's the full showroom and its completion. And what I'd like to do very briefly, and I apologize for the transition style here, but I would like to show you the way in which these layers build up. This depends on a kind of slotting or a kind of joinery technique called jigoku gumi. Jigoku gumi, if you took that almost as the literal translation, it means a kind of hell joinery. And it's not hellish because of its difficulty. It is so because once it's assembled, you cannot take it apart again. So there's its first layer. There's its second layer as it comes through. And just remember, with each subsequent layer, we are reinforcing the direction of stability. If we then add 2 layers of this and turn the corner, we are starting to introduce stiffness at the corners. And then again, they are connected in that third intermediary direction with that lighter layer there to provide a stiffness that then basically creates a unified whole. This is a picture of that section as it's all come together. And again, just for those of you interested, all of this was modeled very, very heavily in Rhino and going back and forth between the engineers. And part of the aspect of the hellishness was maybe in the number of iterations to get that right. You can see though, that beyond just drawing and calculation, you can see that kind of cloud-like ephemeral effect on the left. Here you can see that structure, that joint that I'd showed you before. Earlier it was a toy, then it became a smaller pavilion, then a bridge, then a series of these smaller structures. That now is talking about the joinery, not only as a material atmosphere, it's an overall environment, it's about the light, it's about the structure, it's the skin. It's now doing a number of different things, almost in a redundant manner, but it's now gone from kind of an engineered assembly to a level of poetry that we do try to achieve. What happens if we simplify some of that? Let's take that same detail, let's pull it apart a bit, let's turn it to the side. We are now at Starbucks in Dazaifu Tenman-gu. This is in Fukuoka Prefecture, and it's again along a major thoroughfare leading to the shrine. You can see here that material has been pulled apart almost to a much lighter degree, so the density is really quite light compared to what we'd seen at Sunny Hills. This is not as structural as in the previous example. It does borderline on decoration, but the thing is, what we're after here is a particular showing of the material. Remember, even though we can model this digitally, somebody has to make this. So in our case, we were working very, very closely with craftsmen to be able to cut by hand tools, that 3-dimensional joint, and to be able to cast it over the space of the cafe. So that's very, very important. It is self-supporting, but it doesn't give structure to the roof above. You can see the light coming down through the skylight to be able to show that off. So there's the view from the street. Some key points to remember here. We've taken a look at a single joint, and again, this is one of many. It's an idea that grows across different scales. We tune parameters, we adjust them, we try to investigate the possibilities and the limits of material, especially with regard to where the material came from, its location, and simply just is playing with the sizes. It's an evolution. It's an economy of material, and we hope that it has to do with the kind of spatial evocation. And it's about human construction. And I know I mentioned it sort of in passing in this last slide, but really it has to do with the translation of idea or imagination to modeling, experimenting, and calculating to somebody making that. And that's very, very important. The last category of projects that I'd like to connect for you has to do with craft as related to nature. And oftentimes this has to do with kind of materiality, a little bit more in depth, but it has a much closer kind of initial conjecture to how it might relate to nature. I've broken these further down into a couple of categories. One has to do with weaving. This is a pavilion, again, in Milano. This is the return to the Salone now, about 8 years later, in 2015. The material that you see up on screen looks a little plasticized, but in fact, it's vulcanized paper. For those interested, this is about 1 millimeter thick. It's a cellulose-based laminate, so it's kind of reconstituted from pulp. And the end result is a material that is flexible, strong, and importantly, biodegradable. There's one other item that I'd like to point out to you, that you'll notice a series of holes there and plastic rivets. You imagine for a moment that we've taken ribbons of these vulcanized paper and we've twisted them around. We've connected them all by rivets so that a series of these helical tubes can be connected to create space. And here we provided a showroom for another furniture manufacturer whose work we oftentimes feature. We work closely together with them, but we've provided for them the showroom space. You can get a sense of the scale just by seeing the dining room table set. Here it is from the other side. We provided a T platform there. The T platform there adheres to the Kuma dimensions. That's roughly about 10 feet by 10 feet. You can see our friend there as he's about to demonstrate the tea ceremony. But you can see the arches of these paper tubes, flexible, they're light, they're porous. And indeed, at night, we provided a detail that is all these tubes slot down into the ground there from this elevated platform to provide a kind of showing of that material about how translucent it can be. That effect is apparent at night, and you can see there it's really kind of a long presence. And again, kind of a lighter contrast to the almost Romanesque motif of the architecture in which it sits. Let's do that same contrast, but now we are in the UK. And instead of the backing brick building, I'd like for you to see the central lower image there. It's a series of these coils. This was done for London Design Festival. It's a pavilion and it's uninhabitable, but what we are interested in here is an assembly that is almost impossibly light. I would do well to credit the Kengo Kuma Research Laboratory at University of Tokyo. They worked very, very closely with us in some of these investigations. These rings are all about 1.8 meters in diameter, and they're all constituted of, and there are 120 of them, they're all constituted by a series of bamboo rings. Here you can see a couple of the students assembling them. The coils are held together by zip ties. Very low tech, very low budget, and this is something on which we pride ourselves with regard to this kind of approach. This is a 1/3 scale model, so we can see what it is that we're doing. So the cardboard cutout of the person there is actually quite short. There's that same view. You'll notice a few differences here, that the same coils kind of manifest themselves with the aid of what appear to be shadowy strips at the back of each bamboo. It's a carbon fiber backing material that increases its durability, its tensile strength, and the overall kind of strength of the shape as it were. There you can see it again. We have provided those zip ties again with a kind of color that merges with the background carbon fiber. Why is this important? Well, look, it's important for us because we're really trying to test a kind of space-making device. It's almost making something from almost nothing. You can see that there's very, very little material in order to create this kind of a tube, which you can imagine is similar to the paper cocoon that you'd seen in the previous slide. Let's take now our tour to Korea where that same bamboo is being manifest in a slightly different manner. This is in a gallery, it's an exhibition. And what we've done is we've taken very, very thin bamboo strips. They've been cut from a 3 centimeter diameter species of bamboo. And the reason why that's important is, as opposed to the typical 6 centimeter diameter bamboo, if you cut them into small strips, there's a particular flexibility while retaining the strength. And you can see here, I'm starting to suggest that that provides these waves that are lit from within. It's a kind of a hangout space. It's a gallery. Those curves, and I apologize, it's a little bit light on screen here. Those curves are tuned to the program, to the location within the gallery. So they're either concave or convex, or maybe tube-like or tunnel-like. And you can see how that leads from, there's an entry from the gallery beyond, and one would walk across the bamboo surface beyond these wave-like structures. And indeed, the effect is very much both a kind of high-tech and low-tech mishmash, where it's about a refinement of a material, but in fact, it's very much about something that's readily available, and there's a particular roughness that we allow to shine through. As you've seen in the previous series, what happens if we jump scales? Now we're going over all the way to Sydney, where we're at the Darling Harbour Exchange. This is a central location within the city. And just to give you a bit of orientation, look at the larger image for the moment. There's Utsan's Opera House over there on the left. And you can see there the sequential kind of zoomed in locations there. There's Darling Harbour just to the north. We're down under, so it's to the north of our site. You can see a competition image there on the lower left, the kind of actual situation as it is today. The level of openness of the structure varies depending on where you are in the site. It's surrounded by a series of larger office buildings and residences. So it's really a kind of a surprising moment for the rest of the precinct. What is it? It's a community center. It's a school, it's a library, it's kind of a hub for all of these different buildings surrounding it. What you see on screen here is a bit of a before and after. The image on the left shows what took place before, and the image on the right is the current situation. The reason why this is important is that you can see between some of our renders to the constructed work, we try to tune some of the openings, the positioning of some of these big stranded filaments all the way around. Those, of course, are not woven bamboo. They are, in fact, akoya, which is kind of an engineered, modified wood. It's been acetylated, which basically is to say we've taken softwood and we've made it hard through kind of a natural process. It's a proprietary product, but what's important about this is that it's retained a particular durability to have wood on the outside of a building, and the species have been combined from a locally available species. Here you can see a few of these images here, just to give a sense that this screen all the way around, it's a brise-soleil, it's the handrail, it's a whole number of things. We're trying to use one architectural device to be able to cover and to reveal, to shade and so forth. So you can see there that pergola over on the right is actually an extension from the rest of the building. It's almost a single kind of vocabulary that morphs and changes based on where it's situated in the building. And I'll leave this particular project with a detail of that view. And again, as my role in the office, I'm always interested in how we achieve a particular refinement, especially when we go from the rendering and kind of the imagination to the executed work. If you look at the image on the left, you can see that some of the pieces are lapped. And when they come together in a kind of butt joint, they're actually not very smooth at all. So there is a particular tolerance for sort of a roughness or low resolution as compared to some of the high resolution concepts that we come forward. So there's a bit of back and forth between those achievements there that I think is really quite revealing. Let's talk a little bit about the air around us, which I know probably is not your typical material that we deal with. We do experiment with this though, and I'll lead you through a series of small pavilions. This is KXK, which is again, an experiment in materials that are not the typical piece. To give you a sense of the scale there, that aperture that you see on the left-hand side is enough for somebody to crawl into and then to stand. It's made of 3 materials. One is shape memory alloy, and you can see those in those larger rings in the central diagram there. The little squiggly lines are basically kind of an an EVA sheet, right? It's a kind of a plastic that's sort of got a web-like character to it. And then there's PVC piping that connects the two systems together. The reason why this is important, and I'm kind of giving away the punchline now, is that the shape memory alloy changes the overall profile of this pavilion depending on the surrounding ambient temperature. You can see there in the lower right diagrams there, the person who, and again, I apologize for the smallness of these diagrams, the person standing there at 30 degrees Celsius sees the complete bubble, whereas if it were to lower by another 20 degrees, the bubble starts to deform. And this has particular implications for kind of a nature-derived shape-making technique. So you can see there the close-up of the detail, the entry of the aperture, and you can see the kind of ghosted shaded rings of the shape memory alloy. It's almost been woven together as a fabric, a self-supporting fabric. Let's take a look at another weird looking bubble of a structure here. This is Casa Umbrella from 2008. And this was an invitation to consider what would it be like to put together a beautiful kind of temporary shelter. This is almost like a geodesic dome. It's sort of Kengo Kuma meets Bucky Fuller, right? And you can see there's a sort of fibrous woven quality to the material, which if I were to just skip ahead, it's Tyvek. It's basically those packages that get shipped around through FedEx and so forth. What we've done is we've taken as a unit an umbrella. It's collapsible, it's relatively low tech, the cost is low, and we can zip them all together into this kind of geometric shape. And you can see there, the sequence at the bottom there suggests how that all goes together. The umbrellas each have it's mislabeled there, but it's as a flap. But what happens there, and if we take a look at the detail, you can see the spokes of the umbrella on the left. You can see the brass fittings and the zipper in the middle image there. And then the way the flap would come together and all these pieces coming together in this geometric situation over there on the right. And it can be assembled by a group of students, for example, a small group of people, and it gets put together. It really does echo kind of a temporary way of life. You can see here that you can hang up your backpack, your coat, chair, the flaps open up to provide doors and windows, but it's really about compacting everything that you might need in a temporary way of life for a short amount of time. So that's got a particular implication on compactness and so forth. I'm going to switch gears now and talk to you about this funny little guy here. If I were to tell you that this was a tea house in a package, you might not necessarily believe me, but allow me then to tell you what it is we're looking at. Very light, very ghost-like, not unlike the silhouette from a Pac-Man of days of yore. But what you can see here, there's a helium-filled balloon, and it's draped by an extremely light fabric called super organza. And that weighs approximately 11 grams per square meter, or just a fraction of a pound per 10 square feet. And you can see there, that same platform resides at the bottom, and it's very, very simple. You've got the platform just hovering above the ground, the helium gas-filled balloon above. Over that is draped the super organza, and it's held down by a series of small stones. And in the diagrams there on the plan and section, you can see that it's listed as pebbles. So they're very small. Let's take a very close look here. You can see the tea master entering in. It's basically kind of parting of the curtains. The super organza comes down, and it's just held down by a few stones. So the territory there, this space is defined in almost by nothing. Let's take a look at another unusual tea house. This again is backing over to Frankfurt. This bulbous creature here is made by a kind of weldable PTFE. This is the approach. You can see the opening to the tea house beyond there. And again, the diagrams are a little bit small, but the important thing to note is that you have a site, and following along the top diagrams there, you define the territory, lay down the tatami, and then you basically inflate the structure. The PTFE is double walled. It's held together by a series of polyester strings. So it's both strong, stable, but it's also flexible and soft. You can see here on the effect on the inside allows for light to come in. We've done that similar detail where the lower perimeter has been illuminated by integrated lighting. But you can see a group of people there for a full ceremony in the upper right. And again, that dappled light quality coming through in the lower right image is reminiscent of komoremi in the Japanese culture. And there it is at night. It's basically a glowing bubble. It's something out of nothing. It's very, very minimalist. Let's continue to talk about bubbles and minimalism and air. I'm going to take you to Hokkaido, where we have an experimental residence in a place called Memu Meadows. Normally, Hokkaido is actually quite harsh in the wintertime, and the elements are quite strong there, and you can feel that. It's popular for skiing. It's probably less obvious for people staying there in the long run. This is the view of the interior of the house, and immediately you're starting to realize that the house's walls are translucent. Basically, what we've done is we put an envelope of air on a foundation, and I'll get to that in a quick moment here. That material is a similar kind of glass fiber fabric. This inner layer is glass fiber fabric, and on the exterior, it's a polyester fluorocarbon coated membrane, right? The in-between structure is a kind of a skeleton of larch framing. And here you can see Kuma-san is there over on the left. So you can see that the scale of the space is quite significant. On the right, I've colored in this air layer all the way around. And if we were to zoom in on that detail, you can see that the flap is fixable by Velcro. You can see the integrated lighting, and it's highlighted in magenta in the section at the right there. And you can see that the overall construction is basically a little over a foot deep. Plenty of insulation, and it bears mentioning that the insulation is made by recycled plastic bottles. So the entire thing is really an exercise in trying to be very light in reality, metaphorically, and in kind of actual construction. And there it is at night. You can see the attempt to be able to sense and feel the environment, even though you're in this cocoon of thermally protected space. This is our final project, and I do appreciate your attention. That sense of membrane and openness and the kind of connection to the air all the way around is now capped by a project that we did for one of the newest train stations in Tokyo. It's Takanawa Great Gateway Station, and it's situated between Tamachi Station and Shinagawa Station. You can see there's a very, very large canopy. It's all Teflon, but you can imagine that with its kind of triangulated surfaces, it appears to be almost as though it could have been a folded piece of paper. And you can get that sense from below as well. We've got a series of layered concourses that cover the space in a multi-level kind of structure there. This is the view from within. So if we were to walk on the concourse, the entire canopy is kind of billowing above us. And you'll note that it's open to the air and open to the elements at all levels. Again, you can see the section below with the trains and the cars at the lower level. The concourse is where we're at eye level. And above, what's really quite interesting and bears connection to the stadium that Kuma-san mentioned, the structure is hybrid. It's a hybrid of steel and wood. And that wood is cedar, which of course, as we know from the earlier slides, is widely available through Japan. By night, we take that same kind of ephemeral quality, illuminating from within and emphasizing the presence of it within the skyline. And there it is at sunset. So you can see there the very, very kind of thin, almost zigzagging, kind of lightly sloped lines. There you can see Rainbow Bridge in the background. So you can understand that it's situation within the city. It's a significant interchange, and we've tried to do it with almost the minimum that we possibly could. To bring this chapter to a close, I'd like to emphasize the points of lightness and softness, the means by which we've achieved through experimentation. Basic natural elements such as air and temperature and some of these other elements are important building materials. Sustainable practices are cultural practices, and again, that was a theme that was sort of jittering throughout the entire commentary. What's more important about that is that sustainability is really about a kind of human experience. It's about our place in the world, and it's about a kind of understanding of our environment. To recap, ours is a method of experimentation, and we don't always get it right, but we are interested in a larger arc of development, which is to say that we're interested in evolution and not revolution. So it's never about a single project. It's about many and how they're connected. It's about continuity with our environment, with the surroundings, with each other, and through ideas. I'm going to take you back full circle, and I will be intentionally a little bit quiet, but we're going to back out a little bit through these, and I want for you to get a sense that these are all actually almost the same. Nature, tradition, craft, our connection to it all, our practice of the environment. So we've gone from nature and craft, as in the station. We've gone from craft and tradition, as in the yoga pavilion, all the way to tradition and nature, because after all, it's really about ourselves. It's about the wider beyond. I thank you very, very kindly for your attention and like to now pass back to Maged for the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Balazs, thank you so much for such inspiring and super engaging presentation. It was definitely like a much needed fresh breath of air, and there's so many ways to be inspired by looking at the work and the way you describe it. And most importantly, what was really impressive from seeing tonight is that what I'm personally interested in is the process, like how I think one of the key remarks that you made tonight is that the experimentation and how we saw smaller experimentation of little pavilions start to make it into larger facades and larger buildings. So it's a continuation of evolution, and I think that's what really stands out world-class architect designers from the challenges that students at the beginning, they think they have to find the final solutions right the beginning, right? But I think that was an eye-opener, because that's what always been trying to advocate for, is that it's the process that we're interested in, and that's the process that will get you to that really fantastic or super inspiring quality of work. You can continue to unmute yourself. We're gonna start now our Q&A session. Give me 1 second. We start receiving some of the questions from our audience. Question number 1, it's by Patrick Q. He said that the design for the Olympic Stadium beautifully accomplishes the goal of the Olympic architecture, to showcase and teach the culture of the host. As an international firm, how do you and your client work with one another to balance the identity of the and the culture/practice of the local to the site, and the traditional culture that permeates through contemporary Japan?
Okay, good. Maybe we can, it seems to be there's actually quite a bit more on that one, but allow me to speak just briefly about it. I happen to be just outside of the stadium right now, and maybe I would just point everybody in that direction. It's in the distance there, right? So how do we link that goal? Well, first, as you'd heard Kuma-san speak about the number of different species of wood coming from all of the 47 prefectures in Japan, we talk about unearthing the stadium as part of a larger green network. After the Edo period, many people forgot that actually there was a kind of broader web of parks that was connecting the city. And one thing that Kuma-san alerted me to is that, in fact, really what we're trying to do is to provide that link. So you probably saw the outdoor promenade, as it were, and it's really open to everybody at all hours of the day, despite it being an Olympic venue, or let's call it the stadium for national events. Now, how to balance traditional culture and the identity of the practice? Well, it would be revealing that in the course of my discussions with Kuma-san, that actually we probably wouldn't necessarily draw a line. I think that we are part of it, but we are representatives of Kengo Kuma architecture. We're informed by a lot of those kind of traditional hints and cues. But I hope that you could get the sense that in our investigation, in our research, it's never so much a copy paste as it is about kind of modification. It's a finer working, it's incremental, right? So are we Japanese architects? Yes and no at the same time. Thanks for that.
Yeah. So the next question would be, there's a common theme of transcending scale with your technological experiments. Do you often find yourself transcending scale in the program as well?
Yes, and I think, well, the relationship of materials to usage and to experience is all very closely related. I think, though, that when we talk about the smaller scale pavilions, and hopefully I'm representing this correctly, actually we're really trying to understand the limitation of, or the kind of possibility of a material, the way it comes together. And then as you saw from the Chidori Pavilion, the smaller one in Italy, to the larger one in the kind of Prosto Museum, you can see there that there is a sense of trying to see what that grid looks like on a larger scale. Does it affect the space? Yes, we saw some of the photographs of the upper interior. There's a larger hall, it's a much larger kind of space. So it's related, but I don't know if it's a foregone conclusion. I think that we try something and we say, oh, it could work here, and maybe not, and we get it right, we get it wrong. So I think that we would approach it with a kind of curious outlook.
Yeah. So the next, thank you. Next one from anonymous attendee. He says, or she says, how does the office move from drawing to the site? As in how also do you translate the information in the technical drawings, particularly with wood and the range of scale that you showed, and assuming how craftsmen people will be able to construct the project, like the translation between the two. What's the best way to do that?
This is very, very important in the way that we approach our work. It's, we have to go visit the site as part of our initial steps. We talk to people, we talk to craftspeople, especially in the case of Portland Japanese Garden. We had an initial impulse that we wanted to do something, but we wanted to rely on the know-how of the people who are dealing with wood. So for example, over there, Alaskan yellow cedar, Port Orford cedar, and so forth, all the way to the people who are hiding all of our geothermal wells over there, for example. There's a whole series of things that we cannot necessarily predict. We sort of set things in motion, and in a course of conversations, we rework what it is that we presumed. We try again, we come back to it, and it's a back and forth. I don't know if I'm necessarily answering the question that well, but I would hope that it's clear we would never really just put down an initial idea, presume that that was solved, and then that would be the final outcome. In fact, it's a testing. The reason why we have a lot of these pavilions is that we just want to see what happens, what if, and then we answer it with a kind of small scale joinery, furniture, pavilion, and so forth. And then we try to deploy that on a larger scale, because there are lessons that we can learn about the technique, about the craft, the way it all comes together.
Right, and it's always an excellent idea for a proof of concept. Like even like getting from my background about when we design, like when working on a skyscraper, we don't build it all at once. We have to make a mock-up or just one of the repetitive section of the curtain wall, and we have to go see it before we commit to it. So a mock-up at a smaller scale, even when you showed 1/3 of scale with the cutout paper people, all these makes really an important decision making and very informed decision making. So I agree. It's a fantastic make that transition.
I do happen to have prepared a few slides that I was probably beyond the scope of this lecture, but I was hoping at some point to show the audience that, in fact, if Kuma-san were to have chosen one document type alone to make architecture, it's really about building scale models, big enough to put your head in, big enough to turn around to see how the light's working. We do a lot of that. It's designed through conversation, it's through testing and so forth. So I'm glad that whoever asked that question, thank you.
Yeah, we have another one. Are you working with local, national, international material manufacturers to develop advanced existing materials capabilities that we are seeing in this work? That's the question.
Absolutely. Every time we go to a new location, you saw a lot of projects in Japan, but you saw a lot of projects overseas. And because of a particular ecological footprint, our hope is that the project is always about the place, that is the materials, where the technical know-how is coming from, the talent and so forth. We try as much as possible that we are simply kind of idea conductors. We try to synthesize all of that, and we try to bring it together in a way that, let's say, Portland Japanese Garden could only happen at Portland Japanese Garden. You'll see those motifs, those consistent themes all the way throughout, but it's very specifically tuned every time we go somewhere. And that, to your question, has a lot to do with talking about local manufacturers, understanding their capacities and their limitations.
Yes, we're gonna shift a question that's from just directly particular to you, not about the work. It's from Brian Naktrup. He was actually one of my students, one of the really top students in our program. He said, I have a question to Balazs. I'm curious about what's it like to make the leap of moving to a foreign country and working in an unfamiliar place. Do you have an advice of how to navigate such a change?
Yeah, I like personal questions like that. I think back a lot on that. I mean, as you can imagine, it was September of 2007, and it was a little bit of a leap of faith. I would advise that you try to do it while you're younger, because I would imagine people are more willing to take risks and to put something out there on the line. Personal circumstances compelled me to come over to Japan to say, look, I really want to just be the designer I always set out to be. I want to push myself. I want to learn something new, and I would love to be in new culture. Is it scary? Sure, maybe a little bit. I do have an unfair advantage in that my family has had a history with Japanese culture and being in Japan since even before I was born. Nevertheless, living and working in a foreign country is never the same as if you were to have visited there. So there are some aspects about sort of jumping and doing it, but there are some other aspects too. It's a very internal, very personal kind of mission that you have to want to learn beyond just architecture. It's about people, it's about food, it's about music, it's about a new city or wherever it happens to be. It's exciting, it's bewildering, and again, I'm biased. I would recommend trying it at some point, but take that with a grain of salt.
Fantastic. And I agree too. Like, it's always good for these internship opportunities to, since you're still young and still in school, you go test multiple places in different countries, and then you can see whether you want to continue more of that, or that's enough at that point, right? We have another one from Edward Revere. He said, thank you for the wonderful lecture, Balazs. You talked at length about materiality and the immense diversity that can be generated by nature construction methods. By blurring the lines of the built environment and nature, is it a Kengo Kuma Associates mission to alleviate the rigid and arid nature of the city, of its occupants, or does it resonate more with the different method to practice and promote sustainable building construction?
Thanks, Ed. That's great. First of all, hi. Second of all, it's a challenging question, because I think the frustrating and vague answer is that it will depend on the circumstance. It depends on the site. It depends on the context. I think there is a kind of softness or randomness that we would learn from nature that we do try to imbue. It's a kind of sensibility. I don't know if we would ever hope to impose our way of thinking on a given situation. It sometimes might appear that way in the end result, but in a lot of ways, what comes first is to go to a site, to listen, to test, to see. Oftentimes conversations with Kuma-san, for example, have a lot to do with what we don't want to do, what we are not going to be doing because we tried it out in a model and it definitely was not the right way. So again, the answer to that comes from a way of testing. We ask the questions and we test, we try to experiment. We see what is the right response to a certain number of constraints.
Excellent. I have another question by Amir Rahib. He says, I love the aspects of sustainability within the project. How does the firm plan to continue improving methods and construction and environmental responsibility in regards to building architecture? Like, how do you continue? Amazing. He says, amazing lecture.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate that comment. I'm glad that you asked about sustainability, and you'll note very clearly that I did not try to underscore that too heavily because, and again, maybe as a hat tip to some of the lessons from Mark Takei early on, is that we believe very strongly that good design should be sustainable as best as you can possibly do. I would hate for us to be known as simply sustainable architects. We would be good that people sort of perceive us as that, but we would like to be part of a much larger discussion to say that it's important. And I mean this very, very much from my heart, because you guys are already the new generation in the audience, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we're doing good things. We know that that architecture takes up a lot of carbon footprint, energy footprint, and so forth, and in simply building. One thing that I completely failed to mention in Portland Japanese Garden is that most of the aspects there are hidden. There's the storm drainage aspect. The project sits on a landslide site, and in order for us to not have it slip down over the course of the next century, we basically have to flush water off the site. So there's a storm drainage system that's entirely hidden under the parking lot, underneath the swale, the ravine, and it's disguised as really, really beautiful landscape, but all of that is hidden underneath the courtyard. There are a series of 20 plus geothermal wells underneath. There's a kind of vegetated roof that basically absorbs some of the runoff and holds it there to be able to kind of step the volume of water as it goes into that storm drainage system, and so on and so on. But here's the thing. You guys all know this very well. It's not really that necessary for me to go over techniques that are great, responsible to have, but they're not new technologies. And it's really important that we focus on a much larger synthesis, that we are simply doing good practices, right? And I apologize, I'll get off my soapbox here for a little bit, but I think it's that those by themselves are good to note, but we are very much interested in kind of a larger aspect that has to do with human experience, our relationship to the environment. We're still searching for that, and I hope that came across in the commentary.
Excellent. We have another question by Felicia Francine. Thank you for illustrating how craft goes beyond the stereotypical continuation of associate with the being less than, like how the craft in relationship to design. How would you advise academic students and professionals to move beyond this generality so that the research and exploration using craft are not undervalued?
Interesting. I guess maybe I don't really have the connotation. I mean, I've been in Japan for a very, very long time. So the word craft is elevated to sort of demigod status. And in fact, if you go on Instagram and you see some of the people whose techniques have been passed on through generations, that's the level of refinement that most of us mortals can't really achieve. On the other hand, though, I think there's a kind of love and passion about material, and underscoring that if you are listening to those people who have been living and working a particular technique or a material for decades or for generations, you can start to understand that there is something there that maybe you don't necessarily copy paste. But for example, in my conversation with Portland Japanese Gardens crafts team, and there were many of them, I asked them, so what are some of the things that you guys would like to try to do in a new way, to not always have to repeat yourself on projects that you've done before? How would you like to be present in this project by an as yet untested technique or material? So again, I'm maybe tangentially answering your question, but I think there's something to do with a kind of being genuine with an exploration approach, and maybe talking very earnestly with the people who will effectively help you realize a work.
Maybe we have a time for a couple of more questions. So the one said, thank you so much for an incredible lecture. I have a question regarding the interpretation of or iteration of cultural practice through jointries and details. Has there ever been a push the iteration on traditional jointries? Are there limits to them, not only in their scale or concept, but in their acceptance?
The pushback actually happens primarily with regard to practical limitations. So there's been a lot of, I guess, celebratory or maybe surprise attitude that one could take the scale of this joinery. In this case, it's the Chidori technique. That would be a kind of aesthetic expression. And that's always something that at least through the course of our projects, that's been always supported. But some of the other practical aspects, for example, Sunny Hills or maybe GC Prosto, it's very much about code-related constraints. You know, somebody saying, look, you're making the structural components of the building out of wood, and beyond just treating it, you know, the code has never really seen buildings like this before. So the approach, the pushback comes in the form of us having to compromise, as it were, by giving redundant concrete structural systems, for example. They would never really be front and center. And again, I'm sharing this for the audience because none of these systems are kind of systematically pure. It's never really going to be a pure wooden system. It's always got to be bolstered by something so that the review boards for permitting and so forth can actually recognize it as a stable and responsible building for the safety of our lives. So it's an interesting question. I haven't heard it firsthand. I'm sure if you read the comments on blogs and so forth, I'm sure you can read a fair share of criticism, and that's all fair. But I'm unfortunately a little bit oblivious to that.
Yeah, maybe we'll have one last minute. The last one, what is the rule of representation within the design process from project inception to completion? The section drawings are provocative. How is representation leveraged with the office in communication ideas and create artifacts?
Oh, wow. Well, let's see here. Allow me, if I may, if you'll just indulge me for a few more minutes. I know that we're on a time thing here, but let me see if I can bring back all the way to the end here. There were some slides that I prepared very much at the conclusion of the show. We're almost there, sorry. Just in case, because the thing is, even though we talk about work, it's also, this is not really working for me here. There we go. I think I have to let this spool again. But what's really important is that when we work in the office, it's never really just about the work. And you can see there's a huge variety of people with different opinions, backgrounds, and so forth. We are messy. We get really into the guts of things. We draw things, we sketch things. There's Kuma-san, there's a friend of mine who's working on he and I work together on a lot of US projects. We do things by hand, we do things by advanced digital testing and so forth. None of the individual tools themselves by themselves are all that interesting, because what we're really interested is in the kind of the combination of it all. As I mentioned to you before, we build a lot of models. That central photograph there with his back turned, Kuma-san is accepting the models that will be kept for archive and kept models that will be pitched. And let's say of the hundreds that we produce each year, a very small percentage go into archive. We do it by communication and across disciplines. So you can see there in the top image there, there's a musician. The lower right there's a leather worker. And we do this across a number of different media. We talk within the office and so forth. So there's a number of different ways in which we represent an idea. Because what's really important to note is that we will never really be able to fully represent the final architecture until it's done, and maybe not even then. So we have these aspects that we can approximate the space, and we do it as best as we possibly can in a number of different media, so that we can say, yes, we feel pretty good about what we're setting forward. So thanks so much for that question.
Oh yeah, and thank you for these last 4 or 5 slides. Those are the treat. Those are actually fascinating. Like, these are that people could spend all their lives and they never see what's the insider like, right? Like I've taken so many people to take tours inside like the office and SOM, and they're always fascinated by how's the process, because we always see the polished published work, but actually this is the factory. This is where all the amazing genius ideas are being produced. So thank you for sharing these few slides at the end. And again,
It's a real pleasure.
yeah, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you again for joining us, you and Kuma-san, on such an early morning and working with us and all the committee and all the people and work in the background to make this a successful event. It was a great pleasure to meet you personally, and hopefully in normal circumstances, we'll be taking you out for dinner after the lecture and we'll spend the rest of the night drinking. But it's early morning for you. Hopefully one day we'll get to meet, whether in Japan or here in the US. And please pass on our thanks to Kuma-san and all his team, and for such a wonderful event tonight.
It's a huge honor. And if I might just say a quick word, I hope to continue being in service of the future generation. So all you students on screen or on the lecture, we do this for you guys. It's a very big deal to be here. I also wish we were doing this in person. But since we have a pandemic scenario and we are all kind of locked in place for a little bit, when things do become safe, not just Maged and the team there, please do feel welcome. Drop a message to Maged. We are an open office. Our environments per different floor in our building are very, very different, wildly varied with regard to the amount of mess and excitement. We don't always get it right, but you can see the inner workings, and we would be happy to welcome you. So thank you again for the huge opportunity. And I'm thanking also on behalf of Kengo Kuma, who has basically been not accepting lectures this year. So it's a very special sort of thing to be on screen with him, with you guys. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Balazs, and stay safe and have a great rest of your day. See you. Bye.